The law in Pennsylvania doesn't make any distinction between a right of an incarcerated parent to visit and any other parent to visit. We have regulations that establish that parents have a right to visit their children in foster care at minimum once every 2 weeks. And the standard to deny visits to parents is the same for regular parents as it is for incarcerated parents. Children and youth has to show that visitation would pose a grave threat to a child in order to suspend or terminate visits between a child and her parent. The Superior Court weighed in on this in the case of In re CJ and held squarely that the grave threat standard applies equally to incarcerated parents as it does to non-incarcerated parents.
In most cases, visitation is beneficial for children and supports their emotional adjustment. So what are the benefits to children of visiting an incarcerated parent? They include alleviating their sense of loss. They include alleviating the trauma of separation, maintaining the parent-child attachment that already exists, helping the children know they're not alone, alleviating a child's feelings of fear, guilt, or shame, that feeling that they may have caused their parent to go to jail, and promoting a realistic understanding for the child of their parent's circumstances. Visitation is also a critical factor in helping determine whether and how the family can reunify when the parent is released from prison.
Ideally, contact visitation in a correctional facility is best for children. It allows children to have the most natural bond and interaction with their parents. And for infants and toddlers, it allows for comfort and nurturing and allows the bond to develop and grow. However, even when contact visitation is not possible because of the facility's rules and regulations, other contact is still meaningful and beneficial, even the through-the-glass visitation that occurs in many facilities. So we could use things like virtual visitation to supplement visitation that might occur in person in the facility. However, be sure to remember that virtual visitation should not replace in-person or contact visitation, but just be used to supplement or add additional visitation. Additionally, parents should be encouraged to provide other types of meaningful contact with their children while they're incarcerated. So parents should be encouraged to write letters and to send cards and to take pictures and send pictures and have regular telephone contact with their children.
So Judge Clark, how do you decide when visitation isn't appropriate in a case?
Well, there are some instances where visitation shouldn't occur, and I think we can all agree on them. For example, when the child is a victim of the parent, and that's the reason for the incarceration, and there's still a grave threat to the risk of the safety of the child, or perhaps when a child is a witness in a criminal case against the parent, or a qualified mental health professional trained in grief and loss states that it would be harmful for this child. Or maybe when the child is medically fragile and there's just some issues with transporting the child to the visitation. Or if a child doesn't want to visit and I feel that's an appropriate request. These are really the same factors that we would consider in any case, a custody case, for example, where a child is not dependent. However, this certainly should be reviewed at every hearing by the court because things change and circumstances change. So if a child told me he didn't want to visit a parent, I would want to know why, what the reasons are, and try to flesh it out as to whether it's a legitimate reason, and to talk to the child about it, to try to put maybe some fears that he may have that just may not be realistic to rest, to see if I could encourage that. Sometimes a parent says, I don't want my child to visit me, I don't want my child to see me incarcerated and in prison. And so I would try to encourage that parent to try visitation and to make them understand that visitation is actually beneficial for the child. You know, sometimes children have really fears about what incarceration is like because the only thing they know is what they see on television or in movies. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's a scary place, and so they worry that someone is harming their parent, that they're not safe, and sometimes a child just seeing a parent makes them know they're safe. And in the cases of small children, infants and toddlers, If a parent is serving a substantial sentence and has no contact with that child, the child's not going to have any bond with the parent. And so we really should be more encouraging of parents to at least try it to make sure that it's important.
Yeah, I have clients, I represent parents who are incarcerated all the time, and I do have parents who say to me, I don't want my child to see me like this. I don't want my child to see me in my orange jumpsuit. And I think one of the most important takeaways from all this is to not just stop at the no, to really inquire what's underneath that no. Why are you saying you don't want visits? I mean, for me, I say to my clients all the time, your child does not care what color your jumpsuit is. Your child just wants to sit on your lap and give you a hug. Don't take that away from your child because of any kind of shame or fear of the prison experience that you're bringing to the table. I just think it's so important. How do you, Eleanor, decide when you talk to your child clients who don't necessarily want to visit?
I think it's just as important with the children we represent to explore what is underlying their resistance. And it's also important for us not necessarily to accept it. So we all know it's good for children to brush their teeth. And parents, most parents encourage their children to brush their teeth twice a day. And if their child says, I don't want to brush my teeth tonight, most of the time we don't say, oh, okay, you don't have to. Why would we accept their saying no to a relationship with their parent, which is so much more important than whether they brush their teeth every night? So I think it's really, really important that we explore it and that we encourage them to have a relationship with their parent, whether it's maybe not through visits initially, maybe it is through exchanging letters or pictures, and it builds up to visits. But I think it's very important that we not just say, oh, okay, you don't have to do this.
So what's the judge's role in ensuring that visits occur?
Well, I think it's important for the judge or the judicial officer to take an active role in ensuring that visitation occurs between a child and a parent that may be incarcerated. Many institutions won't allow contact visitation unless it's specifically ordered by the court. So here's some things that the court could do. First, you have to decide whether visitation should occur, and the court order should be really clear and concise. It should set forth clearly what type of visitation is being ordered, the frequency of the visitation, and so forth. And then the judge or judicial officer should order that the same person transports the child to and from the visitation, gives the child a sense of comfort. That person knows the child and can kind of look for any emotional issues that may arise and can kind of debrief the child after the visitation to make sure that everything was appropriate. The judge or hearing officer should order supplemental visitation by video conference or virtual visitation, and make sure that they order the parent to maintain other types of contact with the child, like we talked about previously. Even when the court orders that visitation should not occur, you must recognize that any of these factors may be temporary in nature, and the court should consider if adding additional services would eliminate the factors. Additionally, the court should review these factors for relevance at every court proceeding, because it's possible that the issue that led to not ordering visitation is no longer relevant, and the court and the lawyer should ask at every court proceeding if the issues are resolved, and if so, then develop an appropriate visitation schedule.
So what should a parent's attorney do to ensure that visitation occurs?
Well, the most important thing a parent's attorney can do is to get it in the court order, right? So usually I'm able to get it ordered at every hearing, but sometimes there is resistance from the court or from other parties to ordering visits. So at that point, it's really important for the parent's attorney to put on a case for visiting. Why is visiting going to help this family? Why is it in the best interest of this child? Why is it the right of this parent to have these visits? So the biggest concern that I hear a lot is questions about what the visitation circumstances are going to be like. Is it going to be traumatic or upsetting for the child to go into the correctional facility. So I make a point to, in every case where there is some question or concern about that, to really put on evidence and have my client tell the judge what will it be like for this child to come visit, and why is it important to you to have your child come visit you in the correctional facility. And then once you get the court order, I think the really important thing is follow through. I always say that the advocacy you do in between court hearings is just as important as the advocacy you do at court hearings. So I think it's really important to make sure that the visitation order is being followed, right? Ask. Call the agency worker and say, did my client get her visit? Or go see your client and say, here's the court order, are you getting these visits? And sometimes, for me, I've seen agency workers who are really endeavoring to follow the court order and are doing their best, but are hitting some red tape, are hitting some problems. I think also a parent's attorney can have a role in being a troubleshooter and a problem solver. So sometimes I've had to call the warden's office and say, hey, the agency worker sent in all the right paperwork, visits still didn't occur, what's the problem here? How can we work this out? And then in the rare circumstance that the order isn't being followed, that simply an order was entered and it's not being followed, to seek enforcement from the court, to go back to the court and let the court know you made this order, it's not being followed. So Eleanor, as a guardian ad litem, how do you ensure your children get visits with their incarcerated parents?
Well, the first thing to do is talk to the child. And it's really important not only to find out what they want, but to make sure that they know what they're entitled to. Because if my client doesn't know that she's allowed to see her parents in prison, and I just ask her what she wants to do, she may not tell me she wants to see her parents in prison because she doesn't think it's allowed. So I need to educate her first on what's possible and what she has the right to do, and then find out, is this something that you want to do? Would you like me to talk to the judge about this? Do you want to talk to the judge about it yourself? Because some of the children I represent very much want to say to the judge directly, here's what I want you to do. Some would much prefer for me to say that for them. So all of those pieces of communication with the client are really important. And then, of course, make the request in court if the other parties haven't done it already. Make clear, if the other parties have made the request, that we agree and this is something that the child wants. And then the importance of a clear court order, just as it is for the parent, just as it is for the agency, it's really important for the child. And for the child's attorney, one of the things that I always found was the follow-up that I needed to do was oftentimes with the provider agencies who were supervising the placement for the child. So one of my clients who had regular monthly visits with a parent incarcerated very far away also experienced multiple changes in placement. And every time she changed placement, I made sure that I called that placement to introduce myself, and one of the first things they needed to know is this child has a visit with her dad in prison next week or in 2 weeks. And oftentimes the reaction I would get was, oh no, we don't let them go anywhere in the first 30 days that they're in our placement, they need to adjust. And my response was always, I'm sorry, this is a court order. She will be going on the visit next week. I understand your policy. Let's figure out how we can support her adjustment, but she needs to go on this visit. And there wasn't anybody else who was making those calls. So that was very much part of my role as insurer that the visits would happen, protector of the relationship that I was trying to help my client have. Very important for me to follow through.
What are you looking for from the county children and youth solicitor in regards to ensuring visitation occurs?
Well, I think because the agency has the responsibility to make sure that the court order is followed, the solicitor has to help them with that. So one of the things that they should do is ask the appropriate questions at the hearing. For example, making sure it's a court order that can be complied with. So if the distance is very far, one of the issues is I can order transportation, but how is the child going to get there? So the solicitor needs to ask those questions, and we have to determine, is it the responsibility of the caseworker or the foster care agency or the kinship caregiver or the foster parent or the congregate care provider to provide the transportation. And they have to assist the caseworker in setting up an appropriate visitation schedule, which should include how often the visitation should occur, how the child will be transported to the visitation, who's going to talk to the child after the visitation about what went on, who's going to transport the child. In other words, is it going to be the same person all of the time? They should also speak with the caseworker about their contacts with the parents. Parents sometimes need to be prepared for the emotion of visitation. Even when a parent is not incarcerated and a child is just in foster care, it's a very emotional process, particularly at the conclusion of the visit when the child leaves and the parent has to leave and they're separated. It's very emotional. And sometimes we assume that a change in child's behaviors mean that the visitation was not positive, when it's just a normal response to the trauma of separation. And so we have to be prepared for that. So the solicitor needs to make sure that the caseworker is viewing the emotions in the right vein, and that they're working with the parent to help them understand how the visitation should go. Additionally, the caseworker should speak to the parent before the visitation about what's going to happen with at the visitation. And this should be any visitation. When a child is visiting with a parent, there should be a plan for what's going to happen. Or is this going to be a community visitation if the parent's not going to be incarcerated? But particularly when a parent is incarcerated. So what are you going to do with the child? Maybe the caseworker should ask. You have 1 hour to visit with your child in jail or prison. What are you going to do? Are you going to read a story? Are you going to tell a story? Are you going to draw? Are you going to talk? What are you going to do? And it helps for the caseworker to be familiar with the particular facility. So maybe this is an institution where contact visitation isn't allowed. So it's really important to have some structure to the visitation. And it's really important to deal with those emotions and expectations for people who can't even touch each other but love each other. Can be very traumatic.
Probably the most significant overarching challenge to making decisions about visitation for dependent children with incarcerated parents is the perspectives, the attitudes, assumptions, and beliefs that all of us bring to this discussion. Perspectives about, can a parent who committed a crime or allegedly committed a crime be a good parent, good enough to maintain contact? Can the unfriendly, if not sort of hostile visiting environment of a prison be harmful to children? And what about the children who didn't really have a lot of contact with that parent, or who the parent was not the primary custodian of the child before incarceration? All of these things are colored by our own history, our own experience, our own assumptions, our own perspectives. It's important to look at each one of those, however, and how the issue influences decisions about visiting. So the first is the sort of unfriendly visiting environments. Prisons are not great places for children to visit. No one is really pretending that they are. The typical reactions that the person on the street and professionals, legal professionals and other professionals have seem to fall into two camps. Either it's going to be too scary, it will re-traumatize kids, it will feel hostile, or it will look not so bad and it will feel like a country club and it won't deter children from following in their parents' footsteps. Because that myth of the statistic of children following their parents' footsteps is out there, that too influences people's decisions about whether or not they should order or suggest sending kids into prison. The fact is that the trauma that children experience from being separated from their incarcerated parent far outweighs the trauma that might occur, if any, because of the visiting process. Caregivers and people who accompany children on visits, whether they're relatives or caregivers, or whether they're transportation workers for an agency, can really color how the child perceives the visit. So one young boy told me once that he loved visiting his mom in prison. It was just the pot banging he hated. And I was like, well, who bangs the pots? Grandma. Every time I come home, she's banging the pots and talking and cursing under her breath that she doesn't understand why I need to go and visit her. She made her bed, she should lie in it. And that anger that grandma felt really colored the way the child perceived the visit. So eventually he said he didn't want to go anymore. But after some counseling, it came out that he didn't want to go because he was really upsetting his grandmother. So one of the things that professionals, particularly legal professionals and judges, have to consider is what will the reaction of the caregivers be to the child, and what role can we all play in supporting caregivers, as well as placing children with caregivers that would support visits. The fact is, in the United States, we're putting too many people in prison, and we're placing them far, far away from the families in the cities where they live. So the distance that most people have to travel to visit most of the time is great. Some of the children of incarcerated parents in child welfare will have parents housed in local facilities. So that means that the distance is not so significant. But for those who are housed in state facilities, particularly mothers, when there are fewer facilities in states that house women, it's going to require transportation and time. It's interesting how we can easily not only expect but urge our children and support our children to sit for hours in a car to go visit grandma or to go to Disneyland. But if we're going to talk about having children do something that we, again, the bias is there, think might not be such a good idea, then it's so easy to just say, never mind. I think when professionals make the decision and say that it's too far away, I think it's really important to decide that. Is it really too far away? The child can't manage that distance? Or are we looking for something that could be uncomfortable so that we can say no to the visit? One additional challenge or obstacle to ordering visits or to supporting visits for children of incarcerated parents, especially children in the child welfare system, is the fact that some of these parents were the non-custodial parent. And it's so much easier to support a visit when we know that the child lived with that parent and had this really strong primary attachment. If you ever have seen, or if you haven't, I urge you to do so, watch the movie Antoine Fisher. Because in the movie Antoine Fisher, who was born in a women's prison, never met his mother, at the end of the film, he meets his mother for the first time. And he spends a good 5 minutes telling her all about his life and then asking her, why didn't you ever come for me? Why didn't you ever let me know how you were? Because every day I walked to school thinking you were going to be just around the corner. And I thought that for most of my life. So and I've heard that variations of that story many times in my career, and it's really important to remember that even if children had no contact, even if children had every other weekend contact or the standard divorced parent contact with a parent, even if a child counted on the first Saturday of every month, my dad comes and takes me out for breakfast, that child can be traumatized in significant ways by the sudden absence and loss of that parent. And the fact is that that parent, the one that may not have been the custodial parent, may and often is the parent the child confides in. We all know that children will go through stages where they hate one parent and like the other, where they confide in one and not the other. And so if a child, particularly an adolescent, confides in their dad, even seeing them several times a year, that confidant being gone could have significant impact on a child's behavior. So it's important not to just consider the fact that they didn't live together or they weren't primary caregivers, but what was the relationship the child had with the parent, and what could the impact be of a sudden and distinct loss of this parent without contact. And then there are the children that never knew their parent, had no relationship with that parent, possibly had rights terminated with the custodial parent. A whole host of circumstances could exist where a child could really need the contact with the parent that they never knew and never met. I think all of us need to know where we came from. I think all of us need to understand, what did Aunt Susie mean when she said, you know, she looks just like her mom when she does that? I did a radio interview a few years ago in Connecticut on this subject of children of incarcerated parents. I had a colleague that I never met before who was with me. He was the Assistant Director of Probation and Parole for the state of Connecticut. And he was talking about it as a professional. And all of a sudden, he started to talk about how his father was incarcerated his whole life, and he'd never met his father because his mother didn't want him to have anything to do with him. And he got really emotional. Later, he told me he had never spoken about this in public ever. But during the interview, he did tell the story that when he turned 13, he was acting out in school all the time. And the school counselor said, I don't know what we can do to help you. And he said, I need to meet my father, because everybody keeps telling me they don't want me to turn out like him. And I need to know what he's like so I know what not to turn out like. And once they let him go and meet his father and have a relationship with his father, his behavior just turned around, and he went to college and graduate school and had a happy ending. So probably the greatest challenge to understanding the role that visits play for children of incarcerated parents is understanding the behaviors that come before and during and after visits. I think there are a lot of considerations, not the least of which is the age of the child. So an age of the child is going to dictate and color how they act in all kinds of circumstances. So for example, a contact visit where the child is expected to sit in a metal chair and not move and not touch the parent and just talk quietly for a 2.5-year-old is going to be impossible. And so understanding how to prepare that child, how to make the visit short enough, how to perhaps, petition the court for contact visits when a non-contact visit would be the norm. Understanding how to best meet the needs of children at specific ages is very, very important. The second issue is that children have a lot of emotion that they hold in until they meet that parent. And if any of you have had long-distance relationships, you know that sometimes you store up the hardest stuff till when you're in person. And even in this day and age of texting and emailing, we still wait till we can be face-to-face. So children store this up, and they may let out a whole spewing of negative emotion on this parent. And the caseworker or the person that's watching the visit or people who hear about this reported later are thinking, what a horrible experience. This child was so upset. We're not going to do that again. But the fact is that that's exactly what the child needed, was an opportunity to share that emotion directly, face-to-face, with the person that they have those emotions for and toward. The other thing that I think happens when children visit is that they have to say goodbye. And a lot of the time they don't want to, particularly older children, they don't want to upset the incarcerated parent and leave them in this place upset. So they hold it together until they leave, and then they fall apart. And that falling apart is best if it happens as soon as they get home. But for some children, that's not so good either, because foster mom, grandmom, auntie might not like it or may not react in a way that's helpful, so I may hold it in some more. And maybe the safest place to let it out is school. I think this is so true for children who live in two households, when parents have never been married or they're divorced and they go back and forth. It's really hard to let out all the feelings on the other parent. Most divorced or separated or never married parents don't want to hear how much the children miss the other one when they come home. And so kids store it up, and they go to school and they act out, and somebody says, yeah, it was her weekend with her dad, and no one would say she shouldn't visit her dad. But it's so easy, again back to the biases, for us to say they shouldn't take that child to visit. So a lot of the behaviors are angry behaviors. A lot of them are release behaviors, release of emotion. Some of the behaviors are cries for help. But pretty much we're going to see some negative reaction to most visits. In the past, a lot of judges, a lot of legal professionals, and other helping professionals have seen that as a reason not to have visits. And in fact, it really is a confirmation that visits are necessary, that children have all these feelings that they need to process. And again, there are occasionally cases that for whatever reason children are going to be re-traumatized. And I think if a child is at risk for being re-traumatized by a visit, that should really be assessed by a mental health professional who's schooled in dealing with trauma and relationships in the criminal justice system. Visits are also significantly hard for the incarcerated parent, and they also are trying really hard not to let out a lot of their emotion in the visit. And to the extent that we can facilitate supports for them before or after a visit, we will really be working in the best interest of the children, because if the incarcerated parent can get a handle on what they should have said, what they could have said, what they wanted to say, or perhaps write it to them in a letter for the next visit, it will really go a long way to making the visit easier for kids. There are a few strategies that I think are helpful, first of all, for preparing children, and secondly, for talking with them in the aftermath. Preparing kids really means a little bit of homework, like keeping a journal ahead of time of things that you want to tell mom or dad when you visit. And you know, caregivers can do a lot to help that happen. Caseworkers can also do a lot to help that happen. Accepting the fact that children might say they don't have anything to say and accepting and acknowledging that it's a difficult time for kids to visit their parent. In the aftermath of the visit, it's equally important to be accepting and acknowledging of the emotion. Human nature wants to take away pain. And the first thing everybody wants to do when a child is upset is say, oh, it's okay, you'll see her again in, or, you know, let's go for ice cream. And I think it's really a mistake to try to distract kids before you let them know you hear the message. The message they're giving you is, this was painful, I really miss my parent, it's hard for me, and I'm sad. I'm deeply, deeply sad. And so for people that can just say that, you know, you must be so sad, it must be so hard to walk away and leave after you haven't seen dad for such a long time. And leave it at that, without the temptation to fix it. Well, we can write them a letter when we get home, or because those things are fine, and offering some alternatives and some behaviors that might help and some soothing and comforting tips all can happen, as long as first you accept and really listen to the emotion. Because children, if they feel like you didn't get it, they're going to turn the volume up on it. And a lot of their acting out behaviors are an attempt to get people to hear how painful this was. After you listen, after you hear, after you acknowledge, there's a whole host of things that you can do to try to reassure kids. Remind them that when they're going to see them again. Keep a calendar and mark off the days of when you're going to see them again. Offer suggestions for pictures you could draw and send to mom or dad. Or if you're a caseworker, write a letter to the mom or dad suggesting some things that are going on in his or her life that they could write back to the child about. It's just that fixing it and helping the child to feel better right away is it may be our human inclination, but it's not what the kids need in the moment.
On one occasion, which I'll never forget, it's firmly engraved in my mind, I took a 2-year-old boy in to see his daddy. And they allowed us a visit separated by glass. And Dad was on the one side of the glass and just beaming at getting to see his little boy. And At the end of it, Daddy put his hand up against the glass, and the little boy put his hand, and they were touching through the glass. And that was going to be the last time the little boy would see his father. It was so touching and so moving, and how I had wished that Dad could have given him a hug, and vice versa.
It's very important to me to visit with my mother while she was incarcerated because I needed her. I was a young girl, I was a lady, I was becoming a woman, I was becoming a mother, and I went through all of these different things without me visiting my mom, without me being able to reach out to her, without me being able to identify what a healthy relationship was.
While my mom was incarcerated, our relationship actually got a lot better. We were talking more, and it was a lot easier for me to be comfortable with her being my mom. And she's one of the most important people in my life, and to have a relationship with her is just really important.
No matter what the situation is, even if you think that the relationship is not the best or it's not safe, understand that a parent and a child bond is something that's unbreakable. You cannot take that away from anybody. So when I turn 18 and you haven't allowed me to see my mother in 4 years because she's been in jail, well, guess what? When I turn 18, I'm going to go down to that jail. I'm going to go find my mom. I'm going to talk to my mom because that's my mom. Nobody can take that from me.
Children of incarcerated parents have the same rights as other foster children to regular visitation and contact with their parents.
Most children benefit from visits with their incarcerated parent, particularly when the incarcerated parent was a custodial parent. It can be the best possible way to address the loss and trauma of separation that the child experiences.
The challenges posed by visiting an incarcerated parent can be addressed, and in most cases do not outweigh the child's need to see her parent.